The Dieppe Raid, also known as the Battle of Dieppe, Operation Rutter and, later, Operation Jubilee, was an Allied attack on the German-occupied port of Dieppe during the Second World War. The raid took place on the northern coast of France on 19 August 1942. The assault began at 5 a.m., and by 10:50 a.m., the Allied commanders were forced to call a retreat. Over 6,000 infantrymen, predominantly Canadian, were supported by the Calgary Regiment of the 1st Canadian Tank Brigade and a strong force of Royal Navy and smaller Royal Air Force landing contingents. It involved 5,000 Canadians, 1,000 British troops, and 50 United States Army Rangers. Objectives included seizing and holding a major port for a short period, both to prove that it was possible and to gather intelligence. Upon retreat, the Allies also wanted to destroy coastal defenses, port structures and all strategic buildings. The raid had the added objectives of boosting morale and demonstrating the firm commitment of the United Kingdom to open a Western Front in Europe. Virtually none of these objectives were met. Allied fire support was grossly inadequate and the raiding force was largely trapped on the beach by obstacles and German fire. Less than 10 hours after the first landings, the last Allied troops had all been either killed, evacuated, or left behind to be captured by the Germans. Instead of a demonstration of resolve, the bloody fiasco showed the world that the Allies could not hope to invade France for a long time. Some intelligence successes were achieved, including electronic intelligence. A total of 3,367 of the 6,086 men who made it ashore were either killed, wounded, or captured. The Royal Air Force failed to lure the Luftwaffe into open battle, and lost 106 aircraft, compared to 48 lost by the Luftwaffe. The Royal Navy lost 33 landing craft and 1 destroyer. The events at Dieppe influenced preparations for the North African and Normandy landings. Background: in the immediate aftermath of the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Forces from Dunkirk in May 1940, the British started on the development of a substantial raiding force under the umbrella of combined operations. This was accompanied by development of techniques and equipment for amphibious warfare. In late 1941 a scheme was put forward for the landing of 12 divisions around Le Havre based on a withdrawal of German troops to counter Soviet success in the east. From this came a proposed test of the scheme in the form of Operation Rutter. Rutter was to test the feasibility of capturing a port in the face of opposition, the investigation of the problems of operating the invasion fleet, and testing equipment and techniques of the assault. After its victory in the Battle of Britain in 1940 and the Luftwaffe switched to night bombing in the fall of 1940, the day fighters of the Royal Air Force's Fighter Command was, in the words of the Canadian historian Terry Cobb, a force without a mission, without anything else to do. The day fighters of RAF Fighter Command were, starting in the spring of 1941, deployed on a series of search and destroy missions of flying over France to engage the Luftwaffe in combat. When these missions involved 2 to 3 fighters, they were known as rubards and rodeos if they involved more than 3 aircraft. In the second half of 1941, the aerial offensive over France was greatly stepped up, leading to the losses of 411 British or Canadian planes in the rubard-rodeo attacks. In response, in the spring of 1942 the Luftwaffe deployed the new Focke-Wulf 190 fighter to its airfields in France. The FW-190 fighters were greatly superior to the Spitfires and Hurricanes used by the British and Canadian pilots, and Allied losses over France climbed rapidly. However, the RAF was convinced it was winning the air war, believing their losses of 259 Spitfires over France in the first 6 months of 1942 were justified by the reported destruction of 197 German aircraft in the same period. A major problem for the RAF was that the Luftwaffe fighters declined to engage in combat over the French coast and instead operated inland, forcing the Spitfires to fly deep into France to engage in combat and thereby using up their fuel, placing the British planes at a distinct disadvantage when they finally encountered the Luftwaffe. Thanks to intelligence provided by Ultra, the British knew that if any Allied force attempted to seize a port in France, the German assumption was this was to be treated as the beginning of an invasion and the Luftwaffe was to mount an all-out effort against the Allied forces in the port, whenever it might be. Armed with this knowledge, Fighter Command pressed very strongly in the spring and summer of 1942 for a raid to temporarily seize a French port in order to provoke the Luftwaffe into committing most of its fighters in France to a battle along the French coast that would favor the RAF. It was largely because of pressure from the RAF to fight the greatest air battle over the French coast that Operation Rutter, Jubilee went ahead. Dieppe, a coastal town in the Seine-Maritime department of France, is built along a long cliff that overlooks the English Channel. The River Seine is on the western end of the town and the River Arque flows through the town and into a medium-sized harbour. In 1942, the Germans had demolished some seafront buildings to aid in coastal defence and had set up 2 large artillery batteries at Bonneval-le-Grand and Vringville. One important consideration for the planners was that Dieppe was within range of the Royal Air Force's fighter aircraft. There was also intense pressure from the Soviet government to open up a second front in Western Europe. By early 1942, the Wehrmacht's Operation Barbarossa had clearly failed to destroy the Soviet Union. However, the Germans, in a much less ambitious summer offensive launched in June, were deep into southern Soviet territory, pushing towards Stalingrad. Joseph Stalin himself demanded that the Allies create a second front in France to force the Germans to move at least 40 divisions away from the Eastern Front to remove some of the pressure on the Red Army. The objective of the raid was discussed by Winston Churchill in his war memoirs. I thought it most important that a large-scale operation should take place this summer, and military opinions seemed unanimous that until an operation on that scale was undertaken, no responsible general would take the responsibility of planning the main invasion. In discussion with Admiral Mountbatten, it became clear that time did not permit a new large-scale operation to be mounted during the summer, but that Dieppe could be remounted within a month, provided extraordinary steps were taken to ensure secrecy. For this reason no records were kept, but, after the Canadian authorities and the Chiefs of Staff had given their approval, I personally went through the plans with the CIGS, Admiral Mountbatten, and the Naval Force Commander, Captain J. Hughes Hallett. Plan. The Dieppe Raid was a major operation planned by Vice Admiral Lord Mountbatten of Combined Operations Headquarters. The attacking force would consist of around 5,000 Canadians, 1,000 British troops, and 50 United States Army Rangers. Originally conceived in April 1942 by Combined Operations Headquarters and codenamed Operation Rutter, the Allies planned to conduct a major division-size raid on a German-held port on the French Channel coast and to hold it for the duration of at least 2 tides. They would effect the greatest amount of destruction of enemy facilities and defenses before withdrawing. This original plan was approved by the Chiefs of Staff in May 1942. It included British parachute units attacking German artillery batteries on the headlands on either side of the Canadians, who would carry out a frontal assault from the sea. The parachute operation was later cancelled and instead No. 3 Commando and No. 4 Commando would land by sea and attack the artillery batteries. Land component under pressure from the Canadian government to ensure that Canadian troops saw some action. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, commanded by Major General John Hamilton Roberts, was selected for the main force. The troops were drawn from Combined Operations and Southeastern Command, under Lieutenant General Bernard Law Montgomery. The plan called for a frontal assault, without any heavy preliminary air bombardment. The absence of a sufficient bombardment was one of the main reasons for the operation's failure, and various reasons have been given to explain why one was specifically excluded. British and Canadian officials supposedly withheld the use of air and naval bombardments in an attempt to limit casualties of French civilians in the port city core. The planners of the Dieppe raid feared that unjustifiable civilian losses would anger and further alienate the Vichy government, an unattractive option considering the intent of Operation Torch. Not 3 months later, Maj. Gen. Roberts, the military force commander, is also said to have argued that a bombardment would make the town's streets impassable, and thus hinder the assault after it had broken out of the beaches. The Canadian officers planning the assault believed that the combination of speed, surprise and the sheer shock caused by having tanks come ashore with the infantry would be enough to carry the day. General C. Churchill Mann, who was regarded as the most able staff officer in the Canadian Army, wrote that the entire concept of landing tanks onto the shoreline of France is almost a fantastic conception. What would be gained via surprise, and the terrific moral effects on the Germans and the French would more than enough to ensure the success of Operation Rutter, as the raid was then code-named. The Dieppe landings were planned on 6 beaches, 4 in front of the town itself, and 2 to the eastern and western flanks respectively. From east to west the beaches were codenamed Yellow, Blue, Red, White, Green and Orange. The Royal Regiment of Canada would land on Blue Beach. The main landings would take place on Red and White beaches by the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, the Essex Scottish Regiment, Les Fusiliers Mont Royal, a Commando Royal Marines and the 14th Army Tank Regiment, the South Saskatchewan Regiment and the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada would land on Green Beach. The tanks had a mixture of armament, with QF 2-pounder gun-armed tanks fitted with a close support howitzer in the hull operating alongside QF 6-pounder armed tanks. In addition, 3 of the Churchills were equipped with flamethrower equipment, and all had adaptations enabling them to operate in the shallow water near the beach. Naval and air support. The Royal Navy would supply 237 ships and landing craft. However, pre-landing naval gunfire support was limited, consisting of 6 Hunt-class destroyers with 4 guns. This was because of the reluctance of First Sea Lord Sir Dudley Pound to risk capital ships in an area he believed vulnerable to attacks by German aircraft. In December 1941, Japanese aircraft had sunk the battlecruiser HMS Repulse and the battleship HMS Prince of Wales off Malaya. Mountbatten asked Pound to send a battleship in to provide fire support for the Dieppe raid, but after the loss of Repulse and Prince of Wales, Pound would not risk sending capital ships into waters where the Allies did not have absolute air superiority. The Royal Air Force would supply 74 squadrons of aircraft, of which 66 were fighter squadrons. Intelligence on the area was sparse. There were dug-in German gun positions on the cliffs, but these had not been detected or spotted by air reconnaissance photographers. The planners had assessed the beach gradient and its suitability for tanks only by scanning holiday snapshots, which led to an underestimation of the German strength and of the terrain. The outline plan for Operation Rutter stated that intelligence reports indicate that Dieppe is not heavily defended and that the beaches in the vicinity are suitable for landing infantry and armored fighting vehicles at some German forces. The German forces at Dieppe were on high alert, having been warned by French double agents that the British were showing interest in the area. They had also detected increased radio traffic and landing craft being concentrated in the southern British coastal ports. Dieppe and the flanking cliffs were well defended. The 1,500-strong garrison from the 302nd Static Infantry Division comprised the 570th, 571st and 572nd Infantry Regiments, each of 2 battalions, the 302nd Artillery Regiment, the 302nd Reconnaissance Battalion, the 302nd Anti-Tank Battalion, the 302nd Engineer Battalion and 302nd Signal Battalion. They were deployed along the beaches of Dieppe and the neighboring towns, covering all the likely landing places. Regarding machine guns, mortars and artillery, the city and port was adequately protected with a concentration on the main approach, and with a reserve at the rear. The defenders were stationed not only in the towns themselves, but also between the towns in open areas and highlands that overlooked the beaches. Elements of the 571st Infantry Regiment defended the Dieppe radar station near Pourville and the artillery battery over the Sai River at Vringville. To the east, the 570th Infantry Regiment were deployed near the artillery battery at Bonneville. The Luftwaffe forces were Jagdgeschwader 2 and Jagdgeschwader 26, with 200 fighters, mostly the FW-190 and about 100 bombers from Kampfgeschwader 2, Kampfgeschwader 45, and Kampfgeschwader 77, mostly Dornier 217s.